During a routine hospital checkup, Jonas suddenly suffered a cardiac arrest. At 68, with his health considered stable, no one expected it. Doctors rushed to resuscitate him, and for a few minutes, his heart simply stopped. But while his body was unconscious on the gurney, something extraordinary happened. Jonas described details with precision that no one could invent. He said he saw himself lying in the bed, surrounded by anxious professionals trying to bring him back. He felt a strange peace, as if he were observing everything with clarity, without pain or fear. His consciousness no longer seemed trapped in his body. In this state, he began to hear familiar voices coming from very far away. The sensation wasn't like a dream. It was as if everything was really happening, as if a new dimension had been opened at that silent moment. Jonas recounts that soon after floating above his body, he was drawn into a kind of luminous corridor, where the walls had no defined shape, but emanated a comforting warmth. He recognized old memories passing before his eyes, like loose fragments of his own life. It was then, without warning, that he saw something he never imagined he would witness: his own funeral. The room was simple, filled with familiar faces and others forgotten by time. He heard conversations, felt the emotions of those who were there, and was surprised by what some people were saying in silence. The experience confronted him. If you're watching this video and you're past 60, you might realize how every second is more valuable now. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel. Here we talk about things that no one else discusses, but that all of us, sooner or later, will face. At the moment he was observing his wake, something touched Jonas deeply. It wasn't the fear of death, but the realization that he had left too many loose ends. People he never spoke to again, forgotten promises, harsh words never taken back. There, surrounded by the silence of the living and his own absence, he realized that it wasn't a punishment but a warning. He says that even being out of his body, he felt a pain that wasn't physical. It was an accumulated weight of conscience. No one judged him, no one condemned him. It was himself, facing everything he had avoided during his life. This type of vision can't be compared to a simple dream. According to accounts analyzed by Dolores Cannon in her regressions, this state of expanded consciousness reveals profound truths, accessed only when the soul temporarily detaches from the physical body. The most striking part was when a figure he couldn't describe with exactness approached. It wasn't a relative, nor someone recognizable. It was like a presence that radiated calm, but with firmness. Jonas didn't hear words, but he understood clearly that he had a choice. He could continue and go to a point from which there would be no return, or he could go back. He hesitated. The absence of pain and the serenity of the place attracted him. But then he saw his granddaughter, Little, holding a picture of him in her arms, asking if Grandpa was coming home. That image didn't come from outside. It sprang from within him, alive, pulsating. It was then that he understood that there was still purpose in his existence, and that made all the difference. A few seconds later, the doctors managed to re-establish his heartbeat. Jonas woke up startled, breathless, but with an unusual lucidity. He knew exactly where he was, who he was, and everything he had seen. He didn't try to explain it immediately. For weeks he remained silent, digesting that experience. It wasn't just a spiritual experience, but a call to change. The feeling of having seen his funeral didn't make him depressed. On the contrary, it gave him a kind of clarity that no therapy or medicine could have provided. Life, for Jonas, had gained a new texture. The days, once repetitive, began to have meanings that he had never noticed before, and that was only possible after having almost crossed the final boundary. Little by little, he began to tell his story to people close to him. First to his wife, then to his son, and later to some friends. Many reacted with skepticism, others with emotion, but Jonas no longer needed anyone's approval. What he had lived was engraved within him. That's how he came across the works of Dolores Cannon, seeking to understand if what he experienced had already been lived by others. To his surprise, he found almost identical accounts, described by people from different cultures, ages, and backgrounds. It wasn't coincidence. It was as if there was an invisible thread connecting all those who had been on the brink of death and returned transformed. Jonas no longer felt alone. For the first time, he felt that his story was part of something bigger. What impacted Jonas the most, when delving into the studies of Dolores Cannon, was the recurrence of patterns. In many accounts, people who had near-death experiences returned with an intense sense of mission. Not a heavy duty, but a clear understanding that there was still something to be lived, taught, or repaired. He realized that that vision of his own funeral was the trigger he needed to get out of stagnation. It was no longer possible to continue living automatically, repeating habits that didn't fulfill him. Every conversation became an opportunity for reconnection. Every morning, a chance to do things differently. Dolores said that there are agreements made before we are born, and that at certain moments the soul is reminded of that. Jonas understood that that moment was precisely that calling, the reminder that his journey wasn't over yet, and that he had something to do even without knowing exactly what. Over the months, Jonas made concrete changes. He re-established ties he considered lost, sought out people he had hurt in the past, and above all began to listen more. He realized that his presence, which was often distracted before, now carried attention and intention. He began to visit his sick sister regularly, to play with his grandchildren with patience, and to be interested in the story of each person around him. The near-death experience didn't bring him ready-made answers about the afterlife, but it revealed something much more practical and transformative, the urgency of living with truth. He used to avoid difficult conversations, but now he allowed himself to say what he felt, not with brutality, but with honesty. This change in attitude began to touch those around him. It was as if he had returned from somewhere carrying a discreet but noticeable light. The most curious thing was that before the incident, Jonas had never been involved with spiritual topics. He considered everything a great speculation. He grew up in a skeptical environment and followed life believing only in what he could see and measure. But that experience he had didn't fit any medical explanation. He was examined, had neurological tests, and everything was normal. Nothing that justified such clarity of memory while he was unconscious. It was then that he understood that not everything can be analyzed with instruments. Some experiences only make sense when looked at with an open heart. By accepting this, Jonas didn't become a fanatic, nor did he seek absolute answers. He simply began to respect the mystery. And that completely changed the way he saw time, death, and life around him. He felt part of something invisible, but present. As the news spread among acquaintances, other people began to seek him out to tell similar stories. A neighbor said she had felt the same way when she had an accident years ago. A former co-worker revealed that, in a delicate surgery, he also witnessed scenes of his own burial. Jonas didn't know why these people chose to open their hearts to him precisely, but perhaps it was because of the way he listened, without rush, without judgment. He realized that society is afraid to talk about death as if it were a taboo, something that only the very old or sick have the right to mention. But the more we avoid it, the more unprepared we are to deal with it. Jonas saw in his return the chance to break that silence, not with speeches or theories, but with human stories, simple, like what he lived. In one of these encounters, he heard from an older woman that she had read all of Dolores Cannon's books, and that, according to her, what Jonas experienced was part of a process called pre-incarnation planning. It was as if, before we are born, we choose the most important learnings for this life. And when we deviate too much from that path, something intense happens to bring us back. Jonas didn't know if he believed in that idea completely, but something inside him resonated strongly. It was as if, in fact, that experience had been carefully placed in his path, not to punish or scare him, but to awaken him. This made him put aside many of the small worries that used to consume his days. He began to focus on what really mattered: the people, the feelings, the moments, the essentials. Today, when recounting what happened, Jonas speaks with serenity. He doesn't try to convince anyone, nor does he seek to turn his story into something spectacular. He only shares, with humility, what he saw and felt. Many seniors identify with him, not because they went through the same experience, but because they recognize the feeling of being faced with the time that remains. And in that space, each choice takes on another proportion. Jonas says that he no longer fears death, but he fears wasting life. This shift in focus made him age more lightly. It's not about denying the pains of the body or the limits of age, but about understanding that life continues to offer meaning until the last day. And that often we only realize this when something shakes us deeply. That was the case with him. And perhaps by hearing this account, it will be yours too. Jonas realized that that vision of his own funeral wasn't a dark premonition, but a vivid metaphor for the life he could still transform. By seeing who was present, who was crying, and who seemed indifferent, he received a silent lesson about his real bonds. Often, we spend our lives trying to please people who wouldn't be at our final farewell, while ignoring those who have always been around. This made him reflect on his daily choices, automatic social commitments, and superficial relationships. From then on, he began to better filter who he spent his time and energy with, not out of selfishness, but out of awareness. He discovered that true presence is worth more than 1,000 unfulfilled promises, and that the absence of regrets isn't won at the end of life, but built throughout it, with small and consistent actions day after day until the last breath. In one of the sessions with a therapist who worked with regression, Jonas told everything he remembered from the experience. The professional, who had already read extensively the books of Dolores Cannon, suggested that that experience could have been a type of detachment of the soul, something natural in moments of extreme transition. It wasn't madness, nor delirium. It was a phenomenon that we still can't fully explain. The curious thing was that, when trying to mentally relive the scene of the funeral, Jonas began to notice new details. People who previously seemed distant now gained expression. Emotions previously erased became clear. It was as if that episode hadn't ended in the hospital, but was unfolding over the days, revealing forgotten pieces of his own history. Each memory came loaded with an invitation: observe, understand, resolve. And he began to accept that calling. So over time, Jonas developed the habit of writing. He started with simple notes about what he had seen, then went on to record everyday thoughts. Writing became a kind of mirror. When he returned to the old pages, he realized how his feelings had changed. He was no longer the same man from the past. It wasn't just about getting older, but about maturing with awareness. Writing also helped him organize difficult conversations. Before talking to important people, he wrote what he wanted to say. This made him calmer, clearer, more present. Many of the letters he wrote were never delivered, but they fulfilled their role. By writing, he also better understood what he felt. It was as if, by giving form to the words, he gave meaning to what was previously just a confused turmoil inside his chest. The clarity came with the act of listening to himself. On a quiet morning, sitting on his porch, Jonas remembered a passage he had read in one of Dolores Cannon's books. The author explained that, even after profound experiences, many return to their routine and forget what they lived. The transformation only happens when there is commitment to change. He then made a silent pact with himself, not to forget, not to let time erase that vision, nor let the routine swallow what he had felt. This required effort. Sometimes he realized that he was returning to old patterns, complaining about small things, forgetting to look people in the eye. But in those moments he stopped, breathed, and remembered the image of his granddaughter with the portrait. That scene had become his internal alarm. Whenever the memory returned, he understood that it was time to recalibrate his focus. And so, little by little, he kept the spark of that awakening alive. Jonas didn't become a speaker, nor did he write a book. He preferred to remain anonymous, living more attentively. But in casual conversations, without forcing the topic, he shared his story with whoever seemed ready to listen. He never wanted to convince anyone. He only said that he lived something unusual and that it changed him. Curiously, many came back later to thank him. They said that his speech made them reflect, rethink relationships, attitudes, paths. This gave Jonas the certainty that, even without a stage, he was fulfilling a mission. Not the grandiose mission he expected in his youth, but an intimate, silent, and valuable mission, to make a difference in the lives of those who cross his path, to be a point of light in someone's everyday life. And that, according to him, was enough to justify his return. An ordinary life but lived with presence was in itself extraordinary. He also began to observe more carefully the seniors around him. He realized that many carried intense stories, but that they were rarely told. Stories buried by the fear of not being understood. Jonas understood that fear. He himself hesitated before telling his experience, but seeing how his speech touched other lives, he began to encourage the elderly to speak, sometimes in groups, other times in coffee shops, and even in circles with their grandchildren. The truth is that the elderly have a wisdom that doesn't come from books, but from life lived. And when that wisdom is shared, it builds bridges. Jonas became one of those invisible bridge makers between generations. An ordinary man who saw his funeral came back and decided not to waste any more time. Because he understood, perhaps late, that the biggest mistake is to let life pass without realizing that it is, at every moment, a gift waiting to be opened. Over time, Jonas realized that he no longer needed to understand everything. He had stopped seeking exact explanations for what he lived, accepting that some mysteries exist to teach us through doubt. He began to see life as a sequence of invitations to presence, each encounter a chance to repair something, each silence an opportunity to listen. The near-death experience made him re-evaluate his priorities, but it was in everyday life that he found the real transformation. He didn't change cities, he didn't isolate himself, he didn't seek radical adventures. What he did was wake up every day with the purpose of being better than the day before. And although this seems simple, it was revolutionary for him. Life now had purpose even on ordinary days, even in the bank line, waiting for an exam, at lunch with the family. Everything became an occasion to be whole. Among so many accounts that emerged after he told his story, one caught his attention. A man of the same age said he had dreamed of his own funeral, but never took it seriously. After listening to Jonas, he decided to write letters to his children with whom he hadn't spoken for years, without pretense, only with sincerity. The reunion happened a few months later, and he called to thank him. Jonas realized once again that he didn't need to do great deeds to impact someone. Just be true. Dolores Cannon said that the soul chooses moments of rupture to remember who it really is. And that's what he felt. The near-death experience didn't come to scare, but to realign. It showed him who he was, where he was, and mainly who he could be from then on. And that type of transformation, even without fame, is worth more than any public recognition. Today, already near 70, Jonas walks slowly through the streets of the neighborhood, but with a presence that others notice. He greets with his eyes, listens attentively, and speaks only what is necessary. Many don't know his story. They only see a quiet gentleman with a serene speech. But inside him there is a universe that has been reorganized, an awakened consciousness that no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. He often says that the time that remains is not a threat, but a gift that, if well used, can heal old wounds, renew forgotten affections, and transform fragile relationships into real bonds. Jonas no longer fears leaving, but wants to be awake until the end. He wants to make the now the best chapter of his own life. And each step he takes, even the slowest ones, carries that silent commitment to honor time with dignity and love. In a final conversation he had with a young man curious about his story, Jonas said something that the young man never forgot. He explained that seeing his own funeral wasn't the scariest thing. The hardest thing was realizing how much he could still have done while he was alive. The image of the coffin didn't mark him as much as the sad faces that he hadn't valued before. It was in that contrast that the impulse to live differently was born. He wanted to come back not to escape death, but to honor life. The experience gave him the courage to start over, even after 60, and that courage, according to him, is something that everyone has within themselves, but that often falls asleep over time. The important thing is not to wait for a shock to wake up, but if it comes, as it did for Jonas, let it at least serve to transform. Because, as he says, there is no age to start over. And so the story of Jonas continues to be told in a simple way, without spectacle, but with depth. People of different ages listen and recognize themselves. Some are moved, others feel challenged, but all leave with something new to reflect on. And perhaps that is the true impact of those who live with authenticity. It's not about convincing, but about touching. Jonas saw his funeral, came back, and decided not to be just another spectator of his own life. He became the author of his own days. If you have come this far, and this story has touched you in some way, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, this is the moment. Here we talk about real lives, about possible transformations, and about paths that open even for those who think they have already lived everything. Because in the end, awakening can happen at any moment. Just be attentive.